Snobbish Millionaire Humiliates a Poor Waitress. Seconds later, she leaves him begging. Adrian's voice boomed across the grand ballroom, drowning out the soft hum of music and the clinking of champagne glasses. And to think, some people can't even carry a tray without causing a disaster. His laugh was sharp and hollow, echoing through the crowd. The room erupted in chuckles, sycophantic and shallow, as all eyes turned toward Sophie. Sophie's cheeks burned, but her grip on the overturned tray remained firm. The spilled champagne soaked into the plush carpet beneath her feet, and the shattered glass glinted like tiny shards of humiliation under the chandelier's glow. She straightened her back, her gaze locking with Adrian's. For a brief moment, the air seemed to still. Sophie's eyes held something he didn't expect: defiance, not shame. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, sir," she said evenly, her voice calm despite the lump in her throat. Then she bent down to clean up the mess, her movements deliberate and measured. Adrian's smirk faltered, just for a second. He wasn't used to being met with such composure, especially from someone he deemed beneath him. The moment passed quickly, and he turned back to his circle of admirers, the incident forgotten in his world of luxury and excess. But for Sophie, it wasn't something she could simply brush off. As she carried the broken pieces of glass to the kitchen, the weight of the humiliation bore down on her. This job was supposed to help her support her younger brother, who was waiting at home with schoolbooks and dreams bigger than their small apartment could contain. She couldn't afford to quit. Not yet. Adrian Blackwell was the epitome of success, or at least that's what he wanted everyone to believe. The son of a real estate tycoon, he had turned his inheritance into an empire, dominating the luxury housing market. But his wealth wasn't just about money, it was his armor, a shield against the gnawing emptiness he refused to acknowledge. To the world, Adrian was untouchable, charming, powerful, and above reproach. As the gala wound down, Adrian moved from group to group, basking in the attention. But his thoughts kept drifting back to the waitress. Something about the way she looked at him, unflinching and resolute, had unsettled him. It wasn't anger or fear, it was something deeper, something he couldn't quite place. "Who was that waitress?" Adrian asked casually as he stepped outside, lighting a cigar. "Which one?" His assistant, Evelyn, replied, scrolling through her tablet. "The one with the tray incident," Adrian said with a faint smirk. "The one who tried to challenge me with her eyes." Evelyn glanced up, unimpressed. "Her name is Sophie Carter. She's part-time staff from the agency we hired. Local girl." "Interesting," Adrian muttered, though he quickly shook off the thought. Why should he care? The next morning, Sophie woke to the sound of her brother's alarm clock. 11-year-old Ethan was already dressed and sitting at the small kitchen table, diligently reviewing his math homework. Sophie's heart swelled with pride and guilt. She wished she could give him more. A better home, a life without the constant worry of making ends meet. "Big test today?" she asked, ruffling his hair as she poured them both cereal. "Yeah," Ethan said, his voice bright. "If I do well, Mrs. Parker said she might recommend me for the advanced program." "That's amazing, Ethan," Sophie said, though the thought of additional tuition fees made her chest tighten. She'd figure it out, she told herself. She always did. Her shift at the diner that afternoon was steady but exhausting. Sophie moved through the motions, taking orders and refilling coffee cups, her mind replaying the humiliation from the gala. Adrian's mocking voice still rang in her ears. She hated that it bothered her so much, but the sting of being belittled in front of so many people wasn't something she could easily shake. As she cleared a table near the window, a sleek black car pulled up outside. Sophie barely noticed until the diner door swung open and Adrian Blackwell walked in. The chatter in the diner quieted as heads turned toward him. He was out of place in his tailored suit and polished shoes, a sharp contrast to the cozy, worn atmosphere of the diner. Sophie froze, her heart pounding. What was he doing here? Adrian scanned the room, his expression unreadable, until his eyes landed on her. He approached her table with the same confidence he carried in the ballroom, but there was something different in his demeanor. He seemed curious. "Sophie Carter," he said smoothly. "We meet again." Sophie straightened her apron, her tone clipped. "What can I get you?" Adrian smirked, taking a seat. How about a conversation? I'm working, she replied, her voice firm but polite. Then I'll take a coffee, he said, leaning back in his chair. But no sugar. Sophie's jaw tightened as she turned to fetch his order. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her back, and it took every ounce of willpower not to snap at him. What game was he playing? When she returned with his coffee, Adrian studied her for a moment before speaking. You handled yourself well last night? Sophie raised an eyebrow. Is that supposed to be a compliment? It's an observation, he said. Most people would have crumbled. But not you. Sophie crossed her arms, her patience thinning. If this is your way of apologizing, you're not very good at it. Adrian chuckled, unbothered by her tone. I don't apologize, Miss Carter, but I do admire resilience. Well, Sophie said, her voice icy, I guess that makes one of us. Adrian's smile faltered, but before he could respond, the bell above the diner door chimed, signaling another customer. Sophie turned away, leaving Adrian sitting alone with his coffee. Adrian left the diner that day with more questions than answers. Sophie Carter wasn't what he had expected. She didn't cower or fawn over him like so many others. Instead, she challenged him, refusing to let him off the hook for his behavior. It was refreshing, though he hated to admit it. Sophie, meanwhile, couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to get more complicated. Adrian Blackwell was a man used to getting what he wanted, and she had no intention of becoming part of his games. But deep down, a small voice whispered that she might not have a choice. The rest of Sophie's shift passed uneventfully, but her thoughts were anything but calm. Adrian Blackwell showing up at the diner felt too coincidental to be chance. She tried to convince herself that it didn't matter, that he was just another arrogant rich man who would soon forget her existence. But something about his demeanor told her otherwise. When she got home that evening, Ethan greeted her with a wide grin, holding up his math test. I aced it. Mrs. Parker said I'm one of the top scorers in the class. Sophie's exhaustion melted into pride as she knelt down to hug him. That's amazing, Ethan. I'm so proud of you. Do you think this means I can get into the advanced program? He asked, his eyes shining with hope. Sophie's heart sank. She didn't want to crush his excitement, but the cost of the program loomed over her like a dark cloud. Let's take it one step at a time, okay? She said gently. We'll figure it out. Ethan nodded, satisfied for now. Sophie, however, couldn't shake the worry that followed her to bed. She needed to find a way to make more money. The thought of working extra shifts or taking on another job left her feeling drained, but she didn't see any other option. The next morning, Sophie was surprised to find a small envelope waiting for her at the diner. Her name was written on it in elegant script. She opened it cautiously, revealing a handwritten note. For someone as resilient as you, I'd like to offer an opportunity. Join me for dinner tonight at La Belle Étoile. Adrian Blackwell. Her first instinct was to toss the note in the trash. The audacity of the man to think she'd entertain the idea of spending more time with him after what he'd done was infuriating. But as the day wore on, curiosity crept in. What did he want? And why did he keep seeking her out? By the time her shift ended, Sophie had made up her mind. She wasn't going to let him think she could be bought or charmed. If he wanted a meeting, she'd give him one, but on her terms. La Belle Étoile was the kind of restaurant Sophie had only seen in movies. The crystal chandeliers sparkled like diamonds, and the soft murmur of conversation was underscored by the gentle strains of a live pianist. Sophie felt out of place the moment she stepped inside, wearing her modest black dress that, while neat, couldn't compare to the designer gowns of the other patrons. Adrian was already seated at a corner table, his sharp suit tailored to perfection. He stood as she approached, his expression unreadable. I wasn't sure you'd come, he said, pulling out a chair for her. I wasn't sure either, Sophie replied, sitting stiffly. But here I am. So, what is it you want, Mr. Blackwell? Adrian's lips quirked into a faint smile. Straight to the point. I like that. I don't have time for games, Sophie said firmly. So, if this is some elaborate attempt to, I don't know, amuse yourself, I'm not interested. Adrian leaned back in his chair, studying her. What if I told you I'm not here to amuse myself? That I see potential in you? Sophie narrowed her eyes. Potential for what? To rise above your circumstances, he said simply. I've seen people like you before, driven, capable, but stuck in a system that doesn't give you a fair chance. I'd like to offer you a way out. And what exactly does this way out entail? Sophie asked, her skepticism growing. A job, Adrian replied. I need a new assistant, someone who can keep me grounded. I think you'd be perfect. Sophie blinked, caught off guard. This was not what she had expected. Why me? Because you don't pull punches, Adrian said, his tone sincere. You're not afraid to speak your mind, and you're not easily intimidated. I need someone like that in my corner. Sophie hesitated, her instincts screaming that there had to be a catch. But the thought of steady income, of being able to support Ethan without working herself to exhaustion, was tempting. I'll think about it, she said finally, standing. But I'm not making any promises. Adrian nodded, his expression unreadable. Fair enough. Take your time. As Sophie walked out of the restaurant, she couldn't help but feel like she was stepping into a game she didn't fully understand. But one thing was certain, she wouldn't let Adrian Blackwell control the outcome. Over the next few days, Sophie couldn't stop thinking about Adrian's offer. It felt too good to be true, and yet the opportunity was too significant to ignore. After much deliberation, she decided to meet with him again to learn more about the job. When she arrived at his office, she was struck by the stark contrast between the polished, modern space and the man she had come to know. Adrian was as confident as ever, but there was a softness in his demeanor she hadn't noticed before. The meeting was straightforward. Adrian outlined the responsibilities of the position, scheduling, managing correspondence, and occasionally attending events with him. The salary was generous, far more than Sophie had ever earned before. What's the catch? She asked, crossing her arms. There isn't one, Adrian said. I need someone I can trust, someone who won't sugarcoat things. You've already proven you're capable of that. Sophie studied him carefully, searching for any sign of ulterior motives. All right, she said finally. I'll give it a try. But if I get even a hint of disrespect, I'm out. Deal, Adrian said, extending his hand. Sophie shook it reluctantly, wondering what she had just gotten herself into. Sophie's first day as Adrian's assistant was as overwhelming as she'd anticipated. His schedule was packed with back-to-back meetings, phone calls, and high-profile events. The world he inhabited was a whirlwind of power plays and polished facades, so far removed from the quiet diner and her humble apartment. She spent most of the day observing, quickly learning Adrian's preferences and quirks. He was efficient, almost obsessively so, and demanded the same from everyone around him. But beneath the surface, Sophie noticed moments of vulnerability, hesitations when making decisions, or the way his expression softened when he thought no one was watching. By the end of the day, Sophie was exhausted but determined. This job wasn't just about the money, it was an opportunity to prove to herself that she could thrive in a world that wasn't designed for her. Adrian, meanwhile, couldn't help but notice how quickly Sophie adapted. She was sharp and unflappable, meeting his demands with a quiet confidence that surprised him. He found himself looking forward to her insights, even on the smallest matters. But what unsettled Adrian the most was how Sophie's presence made him reflect on himself. Her resilience reminded him of everything he'd tried to ignore about his own life. The emptiness of his success, the loneliness he'd hidden behind wealth and status. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of something unfamiliar: accountability. The dynamic between them shifted gradually. Sophie wasn't afraid to challenge Adrian when she thought he was wrong, and he found her honesty refreshing. One afternoon, during a particularly heated discussion about a potential business deal, Sophie crossed her arms and fixed him with a pointed look. "You're making this decision based on ego, not logic," she said. "And if you don't see that, you're going to regret it." Adrian stared at her, stunned by her boldness. "You realize who you're talking to, right?" "Yes," Sophie replied, her tone unwavering. "And I also realize that if you weren't willing to hear the truth, you wouldn't have hired me." For a moment, Adrian was speechless. Then, to Sophie's surprise, he laughed. It was a genuine, unguarded laugh, and it softened something in his expression. "You're right," he admitted, leaning back in his chair. "I hired you because you don't sugarcoat things." "So, what would you do?" Sophie outlined her thoughts, and as Adrian listened, he realized she wasn't just intelligent, she was brilliant. Her perspective was unlike anyone else's in his life, and it was exactly what he needed. As weeks turned into months, Sophie and Adrian began to develop an unspoken trust. Their conversations grew deeper, straying from business into personal territory. Sophie learned about Adrian's strained relationship with his father, his relentless drive to prove himself, and the loneliness he kept hidden behind his confident exterior. In turn, Adrian learned about Sophie's struggles to support her brother, her dreams of a better life, and the sacrifices she had made along the way. He admired her strength and determination, but more than that, he admired her heart. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Adrian found himself lingering in his office, watching Sophie as she worked. She was reviewing a stack of documents, her focus unwavering despite the late hour. "You should go home," Adrian said, breaking the silence. Sophie glanced up, her expression calm but tired. "So should you?" Adrian smiled faintly. "Touché." He hesitated, then added, "Thank you, Sophie. For everything. I don't say it enough, but I appreciate you." Sophie's gaze softened, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that Adrian's gratitude was genuine. "You're welcome," she said quietly. But not everything was smooth sailing. Adrian's past arrogance and Sophie's wariness sometimes clashed, leading to moments of tension. One evening, during a gala they attended together, a guest made a disparaging comment about Sophie's background. Adrian hesitated, unsure how to respond, and Sophie felt the sting of his silence. Later that night, as they left the event, Sophie confronted him. "Why didn't you say anything?" "I didn't want to make a scene," Adrian said, his tone defensive. "So you just let them insult me?" Sophie shot back, her voice trembling. "I've dealt with people like that my whole life, Adrian. I thought you were different." Adrian's guilt was immediate and overwhelming. "You're right," he said, his voice soft. "I should have stood up for you. I'm sorry." Sophie studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Just don't let it happen again." "I won't," Adrian promised. The incident marked a turning point for Adrian. He began to see the world through Sophie's eyes, recognizing the challenges she faced and the strength it took to overcome them. It wasn't just about earning her trust, it was about becoming someone worthy of it. He started using his influence to support causes Sophie cared about, like funding education programs and creating opportunities for underprivileged communities. But he didn't do it for recognition or praise. He did it because he wanted to make a difference, inspired by Sophie's unwavering belief in the power of change. One day, Sophie received a call from Ethan's school. He had been accepted into the advanced program, and a scholarship would cover most of the costs. Overwhelmed with relief, Sophie couldn't wait to share the news with Adrian. When she told him, Adrian's smile was genuine and proud. "That's incredible, Sophie. Ethan's lucky to have you." Sophie shook her head, her voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't have done it without this job. Without you." Adrian's expression softened. "You've done more for me than I could ever repay, Sophie. You've shown me what really matters." For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the weight of their journey together settling between them. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was real. And for both of them, that was enough. As the weeks passed, Sophie and Adrian continued to navigate their unconventional partnership. Though they'd come a long way since their first encounter, the lines between their professional and personal lives began to blur in ways neither of them had expected. Adrian found himself seeking Sophie's input on matters beyond work, from family dilemmas to personal insecurities he had long buried beneath his confident facade. Sophie, in turn, found herself leaning on Adrian in small but meaningful ways, appreciating his willingness to listen and support her when life became overwhelming. One rainy afternoon, Sophie arrived at the office to find Adrian sitting by the window, staring out at the gray cityscape. His usually immaculate desk was cluttered with unopened files and papers, a clear sign that something was amiss. "You're distracted," Sophie observed, setting her bag down and crossing the room. Adrian didn't look at her. "My father called this morning." Sophie raised an eyebrow. Adrian rarely spoke about his father, and when he did, it was with a mixture of resentment and pain. "What did he want?" To remind me how much of a disappointment I am, Adrian said with a bitter laugh. Apparently, my success isn't enough because I'm not running the family business. Sophie hesitated, then sat down across from him. Do you want to talk about it? Adrian sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. Not really. But you're going to make me, aren't you? Sophie smiled faintly. Only because I think it'll help. Adrian finally turned to look at her, his expression tired but grateful. You're relentless, you know that? Part of my charm, Sophie replied lightly. Now, tell me what's really bothering you. Adrian hesitated before speaking, his voice softer than usual. I've spent my whole life trying to prove myself to him. To show him I'm more than just his son, that I can succeed on my own terms. But no matter what I do, it's never enough. Sophie's heart ached at the vulnerability in his tone. Adrian, your father's approval doesn't define your worth. You've built something incredible on your own, and that's what matters. Adrian studied her for a moment, then nodded. You're right. I just forget that sometimes. That's why I'm here, Sophie said, her smile warm. To remind you. Adrian's relationship with his father weighed heavily on his mind in the days that followed, but Sophie's words stayed with him. For the first time, he began to let go of the need for his father's validation, focusing instead on the things that truly mattered. Meanwhile, Sophie found herself embracing new opportunities she never thought possible. With Adrian's encouragement, she began submitting her artwork to galleries and competitions, slowly building confidence in her abilities. Though the process was daunting, the small victories, an acceptance letter here, a positive review there, reminded her that she was capable of more than she had ever given herself credit for. One evening, after a particularly long day, Adrian and Sophie found themselves alone in the office. The usual buzz of phones and footsteps had faded, leaving only the soft hum of the city outside. You know, Adrian said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence, I've never had someone like you in my life. Sophie looked up from her work, her curiosity piqued. What do you mean? Someone who calls me out on my nonsense, Adrian said with a faint smile. Someone who doesn't let me get away with anything. Sophie chuckled. I thought that was the whole point of hiring me. Adrian's smile faded, replaced by a more serious expression. It's more than that. You've made me see things differently. About myself. About what I want. Sophie's breath caught, but she quickly brushed it off, focusing on her paperwork. I'm just doing my job. Adrian didn't reply, but his gaze lingered on her for a moment longer before he returned to his own work. Despite their growing bond, not everyone in Adrian's circle was pleased with Sophie's influence. Evelyn, Adrian's assistant-turned-business partner, had always been wary of Sophie's presence. Though she respected Adrian's decisions, she couldn't shake the feeling that Sophie was changing him, and not necessarily for the better. During a meeting one afternoon, Evelyn pulled Adrian aside. Can I be honest with you? She asked, her tone cautious. Of course, Adrian said, though he sensed where the conversation was headed. I think Sophie's distracting you, Evelyn said bluntly. You've been taking fewer risks, focusing more on charity projects than the bottom line. That's not like you. Adrian frowned. Maybe it's time I change what, like me means? Evelyn hesitated, then sighed. Just be careful, Adrian. Not everyone sees the world the way you do. I know, Adrian said. But Sophie's not just anyone. Sophie, unaware of Evelyn's concerns, continued to focus on her work and her art. She had grown accustomed to the strange duality of her life. One foot in Adrian's world of wealth and power, the other firmly rooted in her humble beginnings. Though the balance was challenging, she found strength in knowing she was making a difference, both for herself and for Adrian. But as much as Sophie had grown to trust Adrian, she couldn't ignore the lingering doubts that crept into her mind late at night. Their worlds were so different, and no matter how much they tried to bridge the gap, the question remained. Could they truly understand each other? For now, Sophie pushed the doubts aside, focusing on the present. She had come too far to let fear hold her back. As Sophie settled further into her role, she noticed that Adrian was changing in ways that surprised even him. His sharp edges softened, his interactions with others becoming more thoughtful. He still carried the confidence of a man accustomed to power, but there was a new sincerity in his actions. one that didn't go unnoticed by the people around him. One afternoon, Sophie found Adrian sitting in the company boardroom, staring at a proposal spread out on the table. She could tell from his furrowed brow that something was bothering him. "Everything okay?" she asked, stepping inside. Adrian looked up, his expression conflicted. "This deal," he said, gesturing to the papers. "It's profitable, but it would mean uprooting dozens of families from their homes." Sophie raised an eyebrow. "And you're considering it?" Adrian hesitated, then sighed. "The old me wouldn't have thought twice. It's just business. But now, it feels wrong." Sophie walked over to him, placing a hand on the table. "Then don't do it. You've worked so hard to prove you're not like your father. Don't let this be the thing that makes you lose sight of that." Adrian looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "You make it sound so simple." "Because it is," Sophie said firmly. "Do the right thing, Adrian. That's the man you're trying to become, isn't it?" Adrian nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You're right. As usual." Sophie smiled back, but inside, she was struck by how much Adrian had grown. The man who had once humiliated her at a gala was now wrestling with decisions that could impact lives. It was a transformation she hadn't thought possible, and one she felt privileged to witness. That evening, Adrian announced his decision to the board, refusing to approve the deal. It was a bold move, and not everyone was happy about it, but Adrian stood firm. Sophie watched from the sidelines, pride swelling in her chest. For all his flaws, Adrian was proving that he had the capacity to change, and that, perhaps, she had been wrong to doubt him. But not everyone was as supportive as Sophie. Evelyn, growing increasingly concerned about Adrian's newfound conscience, confronted him after the meeting. "Adrian, this isn't sustainable," she said, her tone sharp. "You can't keep making decisions based on emotions." Adrian met her gaze, his voice calm but resolute. "It's not about emotions, Evelyn. It's about doing what's right." "And what happens when doing what's right costs us everything?" Evelyn countered. "This isn't who you are." Adrian's jaw tightened. "Maybe it's who I want to be." Evelyn shook her head, her frustration evident. "Just be careful, Adrian. Not everyone in this world plays fair." Adrian watched her leave, her words lingering in his mind. For so long he had defined success by numbers and deals, but now he was beginning to see the cracks in that philosophy. And while Evelyn's concerns weren't entirely unwarranted, he knew he couldn't go back to being the man he was before. Meanwhile, Sophie's life outside of work was changing as well. Her artwork was gaining recognition, and she had been invited to showcase her pieces at a local gallery. It was a dream come true, but it also came with its own set of challenges. Balancing her responsibilities at work and preparing for the exhibition left her stretched thin, and there were moments when doubt crept in. One evening, as Sophie sat in her tiny apartment, surrounded by canvases, Adrian showed up unannounced. He carried a bag of takeout and a bottle of wine, his tie loosened and his usual polished demeanor replaced with something more relaxed. "I figured you might need a break," he said, setting the food on her small kitchen table. Sophie blinked, caught off guard. "How did you even know where I live?" Adrian smirked. "I have my ways." Sophie rolled her eyes but couldn't help smiling. "You're ridiculous." As they ate, Adrian looked around her apartment, taking in the modest furnishings and the stacks of art supplies. "This is cozy," he said, though his tone was warm. "It's home," Sophie replied, her voice quiet. "It's not much, but it's mine." Adrian nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You've worked hard for everything you have. I admire that." Sophie's cheeks flushed at the compliment, but she quickly changed the subject. "So, what brings you here? You don't seem like the type to make social calls." Adrian hesitated, then said, "I wanted to see how you were doing. You've been working so hard lately and I care about you, Sophie." Sophie's heart skipped a beat, but she forced herself to stay composed. "Adrian, I appreciate that, but I don't need saving." "I'm not trying to save you," Adrian said, his voice steady. "I just want to be here for you. If you'll let me." Sophie looked at him, her defenses wavering. For all her doubts and fears, she couldn't deny that Adrian had become an important part of her life. But the question remained, could she trust him with her heart? The days that followed Adrian's visit blurred together in a whirlwind of work, art, and introspection. Sophie threw herself into finalizing her pieces for the gallery show, determined to make the most of the opportunity. Adrian, true to his word, remained a steady presence in her life, not overbearing, but always there when she needed support. One evening, Sophie stayed late at the office to finish preparing Adrian's schedule for an important business trip. She was focused on her laptop when she noticed Adrian standing in the doorway, leaning against the frame with a curious expression. "You should be home," he said, walking into the room. "So should you," Sophie countered without looking up. "This trip won't plan itself." Adrian chuckled and took a seat across from her. "You're too dedicated for your own good. And you're too distracting," Sophie shot back, though her tone was light. Adrian smiled, but his expression soon turned serious. "I mean it, Sophie. You've done more for me than I ever could have expected. I don't think I've ever met anyone like you." Sophie paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. "I'm just doing my job." "No," Adrian said firmly. "You've done more than that. You've made me want to be better." The weight of his words hung in the air, and Sophie struggled to process the emotions they stirred in her. She had spent so long keeping people at arm's length, guarding herself against disappointment. But Adrian's sincerity was difficult to ignore. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice soft. "But I'm not the reason you've changed, Adrian. That's all you." Adrian leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Maybe. But you're the reason I wanted to." Sophie's breath caught, but before she could respond, her phone buzzed, breaking the moment. She glanced at the screen, grateful for the distraction. "I should get this. It's about the gallery." Adrian nodded, though his expression betrayed his reluctance. "Of course. Let me know if there's anything I can do to help." Sophie gave him a small smile before stepping out to take the call. As she closed the door behind her, Adrian leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was standing on the edge of something real, and it terrified him. The gallery show arrived faster than Sophie expected. The room was filled with art enthusiasts, local patrons, and friends from the community center who had come to support her. Sophie stood near her display, her nerves buzzing as she greeted visitors and explained the stories behind her pieces. Adrian arrived late, his presence commanding attention the moment he walked through the door. He didn't approach Sophie right away, choosing instead to observe her from a distance. He watched as she spoke with guests, her passion for her work evident in every word and gesture. She was radiant, and Adrian couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. When their eyes finally met, Sophie's face softened, and she excused herself from the group she was speaking with. She made her way over to Adrian, her smile shy but genuine. "You made it," she said. "Of course," Adrian replied. "I wouldn't miss this for the world." Sophie's cheeks flushed, but before she could respond, a well-dressed man approached them, extending his hand to Adrian. "Mr. Blackwell, it's a pleasure to see you here." Adrian shook the man's hand, his demeanor polite but distant. "I'm here to support Sophie." The man's eyes flickered to Sophie, his expression skeptical. "Interesting choice of company." Adrian's jaw tightened, but Sophie placed a hand on his arm, giving him a reassuring look. "It's fine," she said quietly. "He's not worth it." But Adrian wasn't satisfied. He turned back to the man, his voice firm. "Sophie is one of the most talented, hardworking people I've ever met. If you can't see that, then maybe you're the one who doesn't belong here." The man's eyes widened in surprise before he mumbled an apology and walked away. Sophie stared at Adrian, her heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "Thank you," she said softly. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," Adrian replied. "Because you deserve to be respected." Sophie smiled, her defenses crumbling a little more. For all his flaws, Adrian had a way of making her feel seen, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe he truly meant it. As the night wound down, Sophie and Adrian found themselves alone in the gallery, surrounded by the remnants of her success. The air was quiet, save for the distant hum of the city outside. "This was an incredible night," Sophie said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "I never thought I'd get here." Adrian stepped closer, his gaze steady. "You got here because you worked for it. No one deserves this more than you. Sophie looked at him, her heart full. I couldn't have done it without you. You would have found a way, Adrian said, his voice soft. But I'm glad I could help. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of everything unspoken hanging between them. Sophie felt the pull of her emotions, the steady erosion of the walls she had built around herself. Adrian, she began, her voice hesitant. I don't know where this is going, but I think I want to find out. Adrian's breath hitched, but his response was immediate. So do I. It wasn't a confession, nor was it a declaration. It was a promise, a quiet acknowledgement that, despite their differences and the challenges ahead, they were willing to take the risk. As they left the gallery together, the night sky stretched endlessly above them, filled with stars. It wasn't the end of their story, not yet, but it was a beginning. In the days following the gallery show, Sophie found herself reflecting on the moments she'd shared with Adrian. Their dynamic had shifted once again, veering into uncharted territory that left her feeling both hopeful and uncertain. For all his efforts to change, Adrian was still Adrian, complicated, powerful, and unpredictable. She wondered if their worlds could ever truly align. Adrian, meanwhile, was grappling with his own doubts. Sophie had become an integral part of his life, challenging him in ways no one else ever had. But the more he opened himself to her, the more he feared what would happen if he let her down. For someone so used to control, the vulnerability she inspired was both thrilling and terrifying. One afternoon, as Sophie was preparing a report in Adrian's office, Evelyn entered with a folder and an air of quiet determination. Sophie glanced up, sensing tension in the room. Adrian, Evelyn began, setting the folder on his desk, I need a moment of your time. Adrian gestured for her to continue, though his eyes flicked to Sophie briefly, as if to gauge her reaction. Evelyn hesitated, then said, I've been reviewing the latest projections. Some of your recent decisions, the charity initiatives, the canceled deals, they're starting to impact the bottom line. Adrian's expression remained calm. And Evelyn continued, her tone measured, we need to consider the long-term implications. Your priorities have shifted, and while I respect that, the board may not be as understanding. Sophie shifted uncomfortably in her seat, feeling like an intruder in a conversation that was far more personal than professional. Adrian leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. Are you saying I should go back to making decisions that prioritize profits over people? I'm saying you need to find a balance, Evelyn replied. You've built an empire, Adrian. Don't let it crumble because you've lost sight of what made you successful in the first place. Adrian's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. What made me successful was knowing when to adapt. This isn't about losing sight of my goals, it's about redefining them. Evelyn sighed, clearly frustrated but unwilling to push further. She nodded curtly and left the room, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Once the door closed, Adrian exhaled heavily and glanced at Sophie. Thoughts? Sophie hesitated, then said, She's not wrong, Adrian. But that doesn't mean she's right either. You've built something incredible, but you're also showing that it's possible to lead with integrity. That's not weakness, it's strength. Adrian smiled faintly. You always know exactly what to say. It's a gift, Sophie replied, her tone light but her expression earnest. Just don't forget that you're allowed to grow. And you don't owe anyone an explanation for that. Adrian nodded, her words settling over him like a bomb. For all the doubt Evelyn had sown, Sophie's quiet confidence was enough to keep him grounded. Later that evening, Sophie returned to her apartment to find Ethan sprawled on the couch, his textbooks spread out around him. Big test tomorrow? She asked, dropping her bag on the counter. Yeah, Ethan replied, his voice muffled as he scribbled in his notebook. But I think I've got it. Sophie smiled and ruffled his hair as she walked past. She was grateful for moments like these, quiet, ordinary, and full of promise. But as she prepared dinner, her thoughts drifted back to Adrian. Despite everything they had been through, she still couldn't shake the feeling that their connection was precarious, like a fragile bridge suspended over uncertain terrain. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Adrian. Thank you for today. I don't say it enough, but I couldn't do this without you. Sophie stared at the screen, her heart tightening. She wanted to believe in Adrian, to trust that he could sustain the changes he had made. But trust was a fragile thing, and the fear of being hurt again lingered at the edges of her resolve. With a deep breath, Sophie set her phone down and turned back to the stove. For now, she would focus on what she could control. The rest, she decided, would come with time. As Adrian's charity initiatives gained traction, the backlash from his peers grew louder. The media painted him as a renegade, abandoning the cutthroat business tactics that had made him a household name. Board members questioned his leadership, and whispers of dissent began to circulate. Adrian, however, remained steadfast. He poured himself into the work, refusing to let the criticism deter him. Sophie was his anchor through it all, her unwavering belief in his potential giving him the strength to keep going. But the pressure took its toll. Late nights became the norm, and the weight of his decisions began to seep into his personal life. One evening, as he sat alone in his sprawling penthouse, he realized how empty it felt without Sophie's presence. She had become more than his assistant. She was his confidant, his moral compass, and the person who made him believe he could be better. It was a realization that scared him as much as it comforted him. Adrian Blackwell, the man who prided himself on his independence, had come to depend on someone else, and he wasn't sure what to do with that. Sophie, too, found herself thinking about Adrian more than she cared to admit. Despite her reservations, she couldn't deny that he had become an important part of her life. But with that importance came risk, and Sophie wasn't sure if she was ready to take it. As she stood in her apartment one night, staring at the city lights through her window, she made a decision. If she and Adrian were ever going to move forward, they needed to have an honest conversation, one that stripped away the pretense and laid everything bare. The next morning, she arrived at the office early, determined to face whatever came next. Sophie entered Adrian's office, the early morning light filtering through the tall glass windows. He was already there, seated at his desk, reviewing documents with a distracted expression. She hesitated for a moment, gathering her thoughts before stepping inside. "Adrian," she said softly. He looked up, surprised to see her so early. "Sophie, is everything okay?" She nodded, then closed the door behind her and crossed the room to sit in one of the chairs opposite him. "We need to talk." Adrian set the papers aside, giving her his full attention. "What's on your mind?" Sophie took a deep breath. Whatever this is between us, it's starting to feel like more than just a working relationship. And while I care about you, Adrian, I need to know where you stand." Adrian leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady but unreadable. "I care about you too, Sophie. More than I ever thought possible. But I know I've made mistakes, and I don't want to hurt you." "You've changed," Sophie said, her voice gentle but firm. "I see that. But change isn't enough if it's not sustainable. I need to know that the person you're becoming is who you truly want to be, not just for me, but for yourself." Adrian nodded slowly, her words hitting him with a clarity he hadn't expected. "You're right. This journey started because of you, Sophie, but it's become about so much more. I want to be someone I can respect, someone who uses his privilege to make a difference." "And what about us?" Sophie asked, her heart pounding. "Can you handle being with someone whose life is so different from yours?" Adrian reached across the desk, his hand hovering near hers. "I don't care about the differences, Sophie. I care about you. But I also know this isn't something I can promise will be easy. I just know I want to try, if you're willing to take that risk with me." Sophie studied him, searching his eyes for any trace of doubt. What she saw instead was vulnerability and sincerity. Slowly, she placed her hand in his, a small but significant gesture. "I'm willing to try," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I need you to meet me halfway." Adrian's lips curved into a faint smile. "Always." The weeks that followed were a test of their resolve. Adrian continued to face pushback from his board and peers, but he refused to waver in his commitment to doing the right thing. Sophie, now more involved in his charity projects than ever, helped him navigate the challenges with grace and determination. Their relationship grew slowly, each of them taking cautious steps toward building something real. They learned to communicate openly, to balance their differences, and to support each other without losing sight of their individual goals. One evening, as they stood on Adrian's balcony overlooking the city, Sophie turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "You know," she said, "I never thought I'd find myself here. Not just with you, but in this place, feeling like I finally belong." Adrian looked at her, his gaze filled with warmth. "You've always belonged, Sophie. The world just needed to catch up." She laughed softly, leaning into him as his arm wrapped around her shoulders. For the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. Their journey wasn't without its struggles, but it was built on a foundation of mutual respect and understanding. Adrian continued to grow into the man he wanted to be, and Sophie found herself thriving in ways she never thought possible. Together, they proved that two people from different worlds could find common ground, not by erasing their differences, but by embracing them. As they stood side by side, facing whatever the future held, they knew one thing for certain: they were better together. And for Adrian and Sophie, that was more than enough.